So with the LiftUpp Develop app, the link will be on the student's mobile phone device homepage. At this point, the mobile phone will be with the student. They will enter a login, which will be personal to the student. And once they've logged in, any feedback that is collected through the device is automatically assigned to that particular student. There is a number of activities within the device that the student can set depending on where they're placed when they're receiving feedback. So for example, if they're on the ward, they'll have selected inpatient hospital. Once an activity is created, you can see that it appears here under the activity. There is the option then of identifying a number of different forms. Again, at this point, the device will still be with the student, and the student will have completed the various selections before handing the form over to the assessor. If the student has, for example, decided to take a history from a patient and has managed to ask a doctor or someone else who's competent in taking histories from patients to observe them, then they can select the history-taking form. Each form in itself doesn't have to be completed in its entirety. Instead, you only give feedback against parts that you've observed the student seeing. So, for example, if you'd missed the beginning of a patient history where the student has introduced themselves and gains consent, then you wouldn't have to fill in this particular row, but you could move to elements of the history that you had observed and were able to give feedback on. Similarly, there are parts to this series of observations that fall under the history-taking form that may not be relevant to what you've just observed. So, for example, if they haven't taken a collateral history, then you needn't obviously feed in any observations on that point. Similarly, if they haven't recorded the history or they're not expected to, then this part of the form can be left blank. So it may be that you only complete 2 or 3 of a series of rows within a single form. It's important that you understand what the 1 to 6 scale relates to. So this is essentially what you will see of LiftUpp is the form handed to you by the student, and it's at this point that you have control of the device. So if you've observed a student and you're wanting to obviously give some feedback, then selecting the scale button in the top right will tell you what the 1 to 6 scale is a measure of. And essentially, the 1 to 6 scale is a measure of how independently a student is able to perform a particular task. So there may be some things where, as a supervisor or the observer, you're having to fill in a lot of gaps, obviously in the sort of period of feedback afterwards, and there may be other things that actually, even as a year 2 or a year 3 student, they're actually pretty much doing it independently, as you'd expect of a newly qualified doctor. So coming back to the history-taking form, introducing self and gaining consent, for the most part we'd probably expect that third-year students are doing that reasonably independently at a level you'd expect of a junior doctor, particularly when sort of taking histories from patients. However, the exploration of the presenting complaint is probably something that second and third year students will particularly struggle on, and may be scoring down the sort of 2, 3, 4 end of the scale. Importantly, if a student does have some feedback given across this scale, it's important that it's contextualised by adding a free text comment here that just explains, for example, what they might have missed or what they could do next time to improve on that element of their history taking. So just to recap, this is the series of forms that are essentially just a way of organising a number of observations. The student will often select which form is appropriate, hand the device to you, and it's at this point that you then complete any elements of the form that are relevant to what you've observed. Once you've finished, you can add context. So, for example, if the specialty was a medical problem, you could add that. And if you felt it was a particularly hard history, you can also add context. If it were a cardiovascular problem that the presenting complaint pertained to, then you can also add that level of context as well. The other two obviously are not applicable, as this is relating to a history on this example. So once you've added the context, you can click Done, and that's that form then completed. The little number in brackets relates to the fact, or relates to the number of sort of observations that you've completed within that form. Now, obviously I haven't completed any on this one, but if you wanted to edit, then you can go back in and add or amend whatever you wish. Obviously just confirming that the context remains the same. If at this point you still had the device and you were about to immediately watch the student perform, say for example, a clinical examination on the same patient or another patient, adding the plus button allows you to add a further form. So for example, you might observe them undertaking a certain clinical exam. If you've forgotten what the 1 to 6 scale relates to, you've got the option there at the top. Again, add context, so this might have been a fairly straightforward patient to examine, and that they examined the cardiovascular system. When you press Done, this adds the completed form, or elements of the form that you completed, to the one that you've just done before. When you have finished your observation and feedback and you've recorded it within the app, it is really important that you then approve performance. At the moment, this is stored within the device, and because as we're running the LiftUpp pilot, this is running through a website. If you were to close down this page inadvertently, then that data would have been lost. So it's really important that as soon as you've finished completing a form or a number of observations, that you approve performance. This gives you a very quick summary of parts of the forms that you've completed. And then lastly, you would fill in your name and contact details. You just sign with your finger. And once all of this is completed, you can approve. And as soon as you see this green bar appearing at the bottom of the form, then you can hand the device back to the student. Until you see this, your performance has been approved, then none of the data has been saved. And if the student were to close the app down, or the form was to turn off, then none of the feedback that you had completed prior would be saved. So it's really important that after you've finished filling in a series of observations, that you go through the signing off and approval steps to get this green bar at the bottom. And then you can hand the form back to the student, and it doesn't matter about this because the data we know has gone. So either they can close the form down, they can maybe move on to someone else who's going to observe and do something different. And if it happened that they were somewhere different in the afternoon, for example, maybe in a clinic, then they can, or in the emergency department, they can add a different activity there. An email will be automatically generated to your email address that just details any feedback that you've given to a student and on what date. And that's essentially it.